All right. Everybody hear me all right? The mic's working. Guys, I appreciate y'all being here. I know it's late. It's been a long day for all of us, but I appreciate the opportunity getting to come up here and talk to you guys. It's something that I care about, so I'd like to share it with you and kind of get your thought process going if these aren't things you're already thinking about. Like Dr. Greenwood said, I did my formal education here at A&M, so it's always good to get back. We didn't have these big, nice buildings when I was here, so this kind of makes me a little disappointed that I missed out on it. But, we jokingly refer to this as the promised land up in Fort Worth, me and my other Aggie coworkers. And it's funny, we've had all this rain for the last, what seems like a couple months. And finally get down here yesterday, and the sun's shining bright just like I would expect it to be in College Station all the time. So it's been a nice welcome back. So today I'm going to talk to y'all about looking at some power training techniques. So we want to kind of make sure we understand the definition of what those are, how we go about eliciting those adaptations, and making sure we're doing it the right way. I personally I work in more of a fitness situation now, so it's not working with athletes. We're not periodizing a year-long plan, but we see, with the popularity of CrossFit and weightlifting and all these things, our general population's starting to get smarter in a sense, but they're, I think, more importantly, starting to try new things that they've seen. So unfortunately, we have some trainers and coaches that are bringing those things into their programming too, because it's clients and athletes want it. It's fun. It's exciting. But we want to make sure that we're taking our time and taking the right steps to do that stuff correctly. So that's what we'll talk about. So I like to start off with this quote here, and really just basically saying, like, you're never going to be worse off for being well trained. So I like to think of every client as an athlete. We train anybody of any age or abilities to be more athletic, and that's going to be beneficial, right? So building better athletes, like I said, everybody should train to become more athletic. So even if you're working with personal training clients, you can look at them as athletes, and we'll refer to them as athletes from here on out. And all athletes will benefit from improved power. Does anybody know who that is by any chance? Phil Anselmo from Pantera. No metalheads in the crowd, but that's what I expect. So I like to look, even at musicians and how they perform on stage and see the things that they do that we can tie into the way we train people. I mean, they're jumping off of amps and up in the air, and there's metabolic demands of playing music and all those things. So it's really cool to take these things that we've been talking about all day and apply them to really, we mentioned a lot of different sports earlier today, but looking at metal musicians or rodeo clowns or whoever it is and seeing how they could benefit from this type of training. So why do we train power? It's basically the same promise that PF Flyers made to kids. It's promised to make them run faster and jump higher. Pretty simple. So here's a list kind of what we're going to look at through this talk. We'll step back a little bit and define power, make sure we're all in agreement about what that exactly means. We'll look at the methods that we use to improve power and why those are effective. Talk about some of the considerations that we need to take into account when we're designing a program or implementing an exercise or drill. Talk about common techniques that don't necessarily meet those criteria that we'll all agree on at that point and how we can change those. And then look at examples of some appropriate progressions for training power in these athletes. So defining power, our pretty straightforward textbook definition is power equals force times displacement over time. We can kind of combine that to show that displacement over time is also known as velocity. And so what we commonly refer to power is force times velocity, or strength times speed, right? It's the combination of those. So increasing power, we can look at all the things on this list that we can change. So if we increase an athlete's ability to produce force and displacement and time stay the same, we're increasing power. If we can do something in less time and keep these the same, we're increasing power. If, say, we have an athlete that loses weight and doesn't lose their force capabilities, they're going to displace themselves further, and now that's a more powerful athlete. So we'll look at this curve and refer to it a couple times in here too, but looking at power, it's simply the combination of strength and speed, like I said. So we have this force velocity curve where the higher the force, the lower the speed, and the faster we get moving, the less force we can produce. So looking at this, we're looking at maximum force happens just above 0 miles an hour, right? So if we're looking at bench press, our maximum bench press, usually we're thinking that's pretty slow. You just almost missed it. But it's not, you know, you're not throwing the bar out of your hands. It's a slow movement. All right, so some physiological sources of power. Skeletal muscle, that voluntary force production we have through concentric contractions. That's what we call strength. And that comes from the contractile component. So that's when we adjust or improve skeletal muscle, or increasing our strength force capabilities. Also, we'll look at the nervous system, look at the rate of force development. So how can we recruit bigger, stronger motor units? How can we fire more rapidly? And then how can we synchronize those the firing of those motor units to increase force? And we're looking at how fast we can do that, so that's why that's a speed capability. So some other sources that will add power, especially during dynamic movements, plyometrics, things like that we'll talk about. So in sport, we're looking at the elastic components of the tendons and connective tissue, and then we're also looking at the myotatic or stretch reflex that's also going to play on the nervous system. So here's your another textbook example of mechanical model of elastic components. We see that the series elastic component, so it's in series with the contractile components, your actin and myosins here. When this stretches and snaps back rapidly, it's helping us produce more force. Does anybody know this movie? The funky butt-loving scene? This is a pretty good one. So Henry Rowan Gardner here, he's healed from an injury and his tendons have healed really, really tight. So now he's capable of producing insane amounts of power. He's a major league pitcher, right? So here's a good little example that I like to take, and you don't have to get out of your chair for this, but and I stole this, but I'm going to use it anyway. Go ahead and put your hand on your chest and just try to like flick down into your chest as hard as you can with your forefinger, right? So not hurting or anything like that. Now if you go ahead and pull that finger up with your other hand and then flick down, you've got a lot more power there, right? Because we're stretching those elastic components and letting them snap. Okay, so then looking at the neurophysiological model, the nervous system, we focus on muscle spindles and how they react to being stretched rapidly. So when these get stretched, they think, oh no, the muscle's about to get torn, so I need to prevent that. So they're sending a signal to the spinal cord and right back to the muscle that tells it to contract, right? So that literally doesn't even have to cross our mind. We don't have to think, hey, this feels like it's stretching a little too far. I'm gonna go ahead and contract that muscle. That reflex takes care of it for us. And here's our common example of what the myotatic or stretch reflex is. So the knee-jerk reaction or the patellar reflex. Right, so you sit in the doctor's office, he hits your patellar tendon and your leg kicks up. All right, so talking about strength beyond strength, which is the kind of what I put in the title of this presentation, which is a nod to Pantera, if you didn't catch that. Using plyometric and other power techniques, they're going to combine the force that we have from voluntary muscle contraction. So thinking what we're doing when we squat from the ground, we combine that with the reflex and the elastic components, we can create even more force than what we're voluntarily capable of. And using those things is really where our power training is going to focus. So looking at a few different examples of jumping, we can kind of see how as we progress, the levels of all the sources of power we're bringing in are going to improve. So static jumps, if I squat down, I pause for a couple seconds and then try to jump up, I'm not going to get as high as I do if I go down forcefully and jump up, because now with the counter movement jump, I'm bringing in the elastic components, probably not activating that stretch reflex yet. But when we bring in plyometric jumps, so I jump, hit the ground forcefully, and then jump back up, now I'm using the elastic components and that reflex to launch me even higher into the air. So power provides the ability to do all these things, basically making us a better athlete. Change directions quickly, jump high, run fast, which we'll talk about, launch an object into the air, brace ourselves from a fall, and list goes on and on. So how exactly do we train power? To start off, we're going to measure an athlete's power, right? Because we want to kind of have that baseline and see on down the road how much we've improved. When we measure power, we usually think of the vertical jump. So how high can you jump straight up into the air? Broad jump's a good one, a 40-yard sprint, and then weightlifting maxes could even be, would be a good measurement of power. And so let's think about what these tests all actually are testing, right? They're a display of how much force we're imparting to the ground and how quickly we're doing that, right? So the more force I can put into the ground before I come off the ground, the higher I'm going to go into the air. So that's Newton's third law of motion, right? Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So the force I put in the ground is going to be directly perceived by me launching into the air, or sprinting forward, or lifting a weight, so on. So that's going to be important as we move on talking about techniques that we use to train this. So here we have Jamie Collins doing a vertical jump. Pretty impressive 41.5-inch vertical jump there. This was back at the 2013 Combine. Does anybody by any chance know the one person that jumped higher than him that year? It was Texas A&M's very own Kristen Michael, jumped 43 inches. So pretty, yeah, it's just insane height. But we'll look at that, and we can see, we'll look at the position of his body and all these different things kind of in pictures as it slowed down in a little bit. But we see he's pushing that force into the ground through his legs, and it's shooting him up into the air. All right, so some techniques that we use to train power. Jump training and plyometrics, which is a pretty common one that we think of. Sprint and speed training. Olympic lifts or weightlifting, using ballistics, and then even strength training. So as we go through these methods, we're going to kind of work back along that force velocity curve. We start up there at strength, which we talked about is very slow speed, but working on force production. Then we move down into strength, speed, power, speed, strength, and then we're just trying to move as fast as we can. So strength training is the foundation of becoming more powerful or creating a powerful athlete. That's going to be the limit. You can't produce more force at high speeds than you can produce at slow speeds, right? So if we can increase an athlete's ability to produce force, say in a single rep squat, we're shifting that force velocity curve up. So now at any, at given speeds, as we start to increase speed, we're still producing more force than we used to. So like I said, squats build the force capabilities of that hip and knee extension that we're going to see in jumps. Deadlifts will build posterior chain strength. They're going to teach you to synchronize those muscles in the posterior chain and then help increase the rate of force development. So since we're going from a complete dead stop, we're having to just, what's the word I'm looking for, recruit those motor units immediately, right? So that's effective if we're doing starts off the line in football, something like that, where we don't have that counter movement ability. And then overload is going to start to prepare the bones, muscles, tendons for the shock that we're going to put on them as we move forward in this power training. Weightlifting, as we're moving on down that force velocity curve, we're talking about the Olympic lifts, any of those variations, so hang cleans, power cleans, those types of things. These will enhance power when they're done correctly. So form is key here because we want to prevent energy leaks. If we have energy leaking from that kinetic chain, then we're not pushing the power or that force where we want it to go. So this works down, like I said, from the strength part, we're working to the strength speed part of the force velocity curve. So this use of triple extension in weightlifting translates well into just about every sport, right? And although we don't see weightlifters typically have a whole lot of vertical displacement, as you can see in this picture, they definitely have the capability to jump in the air, right? That weight's obviously holding them down, the points to lift the weight, but they're training all those same systems to be able to jump. Plyometrics and jump training. This is where we're going to start to utilize the stretch shortening cycle to improve power, further strengthening tissues, and then again focusing on form to make sure there's no kinetic chain energy leaks. So I've heard a couple other people mention energy leaks in presentations earlier today, so I kind of have a little analogy of how to think about this. So if we have a water hose that's got no leaks, right? We shoot that water out, and given that the power is good, we got a good steady stream with a lot of force behind it, right? But now if we take a water hose and cut a bunch of holes in it, so before the water gets to the end of the hose, it's leaking out everywhere, then we end up with something like that. That's not a very athletic water hose right there. All right? So this is going to enhance the ability to decelerate and then switch to concentric muscle contraction. That amortization phase, that time between eccentric and concentric contractions, we want to minimize that. We're also going to dampen the effect of the Golgi tendon organs that are telling the antagonist muscles to contract. We want to turn those off so they're not slowing us down. And then here we're working kind of the middle of the force velocity curve, that just straight power section. And this is really what we're talking about here, is when we get into really high level plyometrics with depth jumps and things like that. So here's another just kind of textbook definition from Mel Siff on what plyometrics actually are. So just because someone's jumping doesn't mean it's plyometrics, right? Plyometrics involves that your body's moving through space, it hits the ground, slows down, and then launches back into space, okay? So those are some key things that we're talking about with plyometrics. Again, I stole this one from Jared Wilson. I told him I'd give him credit. But we're going to have a little example of what stretch shortening cycle looks like. So as we hit the brake, that's our eccentric contraction. We want to move to the gas, the concentric muscle contraction, as fast as possible, because all that time in between is where we're losing energy. So hopefully this, I'll click it up here. So an untrained athlete, we're going to see pretty slow movement from that brake to the gas, right? But then after training, we want to see, hopefully, oh. Oh, wait a second. There we go. So we want to see that go boom, boom, right? So no time wasted in between those two things. Sorry, the clicker's giving me some trouble. Computer's tired even. All right, ballistics. So here we're talking about launching objects through space. Might also be catching objects and sending them back. And then this is working on down the force velocity curve to the speed strength area of the curve. All right, so here we're going to have just a little video example of what some ballistic exercises might look like, if it'll play. Nope. Yeah. Well, we'll try to keep moving through. All right, well, that was a video of him throwing that ball up in the air, slamming it, throwing it against the wall, right? Sprint training. We're going to focus on the acceleration portion of a sprint. If we're focused strictly on power, then we're not looking to condition these athletes right now. So depending on the sport and the position and all those kinds of things, we're looking at 10 to 60 yards. When we can put more force into the ground, we're improving stride length, which is one of the two components of speed. And they're also improving stride frequency as we can fire those muscles quicker to turn the legs over. And then as we train power, we're reducing the time we're on the ground so that we're pushing forward quicker, enhancing the rate of force development. Should push this 10 seconds early next time. All right. So something interesting to look at with sprint training. This is from one of Mike Boyle's books, but he was comparing two different athletes in their 40-yard dash times, and so we can see that pretty big difference in weight with these two athletes, and a considerable difference in their 40-yard time. But the only difference throughout these different separate 10-yard measurements was in that first 10 yards. So if athlete number 2 is chasing athlete number 1, he's got to get a jump on him, right? Because once he gets that first 10 yards away from him, then it's over. So that's why that 10 yards is so important. That explosion from the line or from a complete stop is really important. And we talked about this earlier. That happens in about 3 or 4 steps for an athlete, right? So that's very, very quick, and it's not a whole bunch of repetitions. There's no reason to try to run these athletes ragged to try to improve power. All right, so some considerations when we're training power. We want to look at the things, kind of have a checklist as we go through these things, and make sure we're meeting all the criteria to focus on the goal that we have. Training power can't just be a monkey see, monkey do type of situation, right? To be effective as coaches, we have to know why we're doing a certain thing and how it's going to improve that athlete. We can't just look up drills on YouTube and say, that looks fun, I think I'm going to go try that with my athletes today, right? And I think there's a little too much of that going on, but that's why we're all here trying to make sure we're understanding what it is we're doing. So power work is synonymous with central nervous system work. Goal is not to end up gassing these athletes out. A lot of these things that we do with box jumps and sprints and weightlifting, they're metabolically demanding for sure, but that's not the end goal. Repetitions need to be kept short. We want to ensure optimal transmission of action potentials. Make sure that this is all focused on the nervous system, right? We're not trying to challenge the heart and lungs here. We're not trying to sweat a bunch, leave athletes lying on the ground, that sort of thing. So when we're taking in considerations of training power, we want to look at sport specificity and the functionality of what we're using here. So requirements of the sport, what is the athlete going to be landing on? How far are they going to have to sprint? What body positions are they going to have to get into? Is this a functional movement pattern? So we did mention that functional kind of is misused a lot. But in this case, we're saying, does it serve a purpose? Does it have a function? So jokingly here, I've said, don't focus on the funk. You're not trying to come up with funky exercises, a jump from a Bosu ball to a shoulder press, whatever. Those things are trying to impress people because they look cool, or some people think they look cool. But if that doesn't, you never have an athlete that's going to be landing on a Bosu ball. Why is that something you're going to be using? Cool. Next up, safety. This is a big one. Arguably, our number one job is to make sure an athlete's safe and make them less susceptible to injury as they go forward and compete. If an athlete gets hurt in the weight room, they sure as heck can't play. And if they're susceptible to injury out on the field, they're not going to play very long. So that's our job to prevent that from happening. Do we have to ask ourselves, should we be putting our athletes in compromised positions when they're fatigued? So those compromised positions might be that I got weight lifted over my head, or I'm strapped into weight doing cleans and I'm tired. I might have something under my feet while I'm jumping under fatigue, and as I get tired, I'm getting closer and closer to falling over that object. Might be hanging from an object doing pull-ups to exhaustion, or swinging around on it. Whatever. You've seen a lot of bad examples of this stuff. Then for safety, we want to make sure the athlete has the technical ability and strength required. So minimum strength requirements, that's kind of for you to decide and judge as the coach or the trainer there. You want to make sure somebody can squat, keep their knees in line before you start them jumping. And you also want to ask yourself, does this particular athlete need to get in that position? So do we necessarily need to have basketball players doing pulls from the floor to train that power and weightlifting? Probably not. Overall goal during the particular time of season, or I don't know what you have, particular time of season, or what our main focus is at the time. If we're putting, for instance, power and conditioning together, those are conflicting goals. So we're dampening the effects of each one at that time. So we want to make sure that we're not trying to put all our eggs in one basket or put it all within the same period of training. We want to focus on one thing and do it perfect. So some techniques to reevaluate. We've gone through these criteria and said these are the things we need to do and need to take into consideration if we're going to train power in an athlete. So we'll look at some techniques here that I think are pretty common. I see them a lot, and I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. Hopefully not as much in the professional field as with just people trying things out that they've seen on YouTube and all over the internet. But we'll look at some reasons these techniques aren't producing power the way people think they are. So again, we'll cover those parameters for power that we said. It needs to be safe, it needs to be specific, it meets our overall goal. Technique is sound before we move into using these exercises or drills, and that we're overloading the proper systems, namely the nervous system here. So this even got mentioned earlier today that J.J. Watt doing his big tall box jump. I'm personally not a big fan, but it's impressive looking, right? I found it on the internet, so it's getting around. But you can see that he's making some adjustments to be able to get his feet and land up there, right? So there's no doubt the guy's powerful. But when we have athletes, clients, patrons, whatever, that see these kinds of things, they want to go in and try it. We get stuff like this that happens, and that's a pretty tame fall, right? I mean, it could be a lot worse. So from a safety issue right there, we know that's not meeting that criteria. More importantly, we want to note that higher landing isn't improving the force we imparted into the ground, right? So what happens in the air is really irrelevant. Well, all we're concerned with is that force we can impart into the ground, and then everything that happens after that is irrelevant, again, like I said. So we've taken this box jump for height and used it as a measurement. It's impressive. It's hard to do. It takes practice, but I think that's a skill that you learn and practice to get better at. So your vertical jump doesn't have to improve for you to get higher and higher on a box jump. So if we make another example of this that seems even a little bit more ridiculous, but say you have people competing to see who can clap their hands the most times in midair, right? So they jump and clap a bunch of times and land. What they're going to do is they're going to learn, number one, how to clap faster. But that doesn't mean, like, if they get more claps in the air, that doesn't mean that they got more powerful, correct? So same thing, if they learn how to get their feet higher, get their knees higher up to their chest and land on a higher box, that doesn't mean they got any more powerful. That just means they kind of learned a trick. Now, if they get more powerful, they're going to be able to get on a higher box or clap their hands more often, but we got to make sure that we understand which one's the cause and the effect. And then we're looking at the landing position. For most athletes, landing with your knees up into your chest is not conducive to sport. As we talked about before, this counter movement jump that we use for a box jump isn't really stimulating the stretch shortening cycle. We're probably not tapping into that myotatic reflex here. And then the other thing is, like we said before, or saw in that last video, there's really no safe way to miss an attempt here. Basically, to figure out your max box jump height is you count the one that you got before you fell, right? That's not a good way to test. So going back to the landing position here, what we want athletes to do is land in a similar position, respected the hip and knee angle that they're going to take off for their next jump. So right here we got a guy that's landing from a jump and about to go into a second jump, okay? So we'll kind of note where his hip and knee angle. Now if we put him jumping on a box that's an appropriate height, he's got a pretty similar hip and knee angle. If we put 6 plates on here, which is not an incredibly tall box, and this guy was a Division I high jumper, so he should be able to jump pretty high. If we put 6 plates on top of that box, we already see that his hips are landing below his knees. Now, if that happens in sport, you're either getting run past or run over, right? That's not a good position for you to be in. All right. And then comparing methods, when we look at how we progress plyometrics and kind of ending up with depth jumps that are going to be the most intense form of this. Depth jumps, when they're properly programmed and people reach that in a reasonable amount of time, they're going to elicit a much stronger activation of the stretch shortening cycle, and they're going to produce greater results in vertical displacement, right? So if you take 2 athletes, one's practicing counter movement jumps and practicing their vertical, they'll get a little bit of improvement, but you come back and test the guy that was practicing depth jumps, he's gonna change his vertical displacement even more on a counter movement jump. Another thing we look at is box jumps for reps. For conditioning purposes, I would argue that this is easier than doing tuck jumps, right? So if I'm able to jump, catch myself in the air and then step or jump back down, that's actually going to be easier than if I'm jumping in the air at a similar height and landing on the ground. So I understand the argument of you're ensuring that somebody's jumping at least so high to get on top of the box. But again, we're coaches. We're supposed to be watching those things, and there's ways to make sure that they do that. You can also use hurdles, other things for them to jump over that aren't going to be as dangerous as a box. Again, with the safety issue, we said that jumping onto something while we're fatigued is probably not a good idea. We're not trying to grow new kneecaps on any of our clients. And if you're squeamish, don't look at this next one, but you've probably all seen stuff like that, where he's going to have that nice scar and reminder of why he shouldn't have been doing those jumps for years to come. So moving on to the next one, sprints with incomplete rest. Like we said, adequate rest is required to enhance speed because we're talking about power here. We're working on the central nervous system, not the cardiorespiratory system, okay? Conditioning work is at a different time, different day, whatever. But if we want to really work power and speed, then we need to focus on the central nervous system. Sprints can be effective for both goals. It's really not dangerous to be running fatigued. I mean, you want to make sure form doesn't suffer and things like that, but you have to periodize that appropriately. And this was a pretty funny gif of how you look when you're running tired. If you've seen Superbad, it's Jonah Hill running with his arms being all floppy and everything, so you can imagine. But that's not what we want to see in an athlete if we're trying to make them faster. Moving on to Olympic lifts for conditioning. This has been pretty common again. I think this is one of the main offenders of people think, well, if people use that type of exercise for power production, then if I do it a bunch of times, even if I'm doing it 20, 30 reps, then I'm working on power. We know that's not the case. So safety is an issue, but then I guess maybe not more importantly, but another big concern here is that technique's going to suffer. We know that those are super technically, you got to be technically savvy to do those lifts appropriately. If we're having people do them 10, 20 reps, they're losing form, they're figuring out an easier way to cheat that, and then they're going to learn that pattern, right? So we're ingraining or grooving those inefficient movement patterns and teaching them to be worse athletes. So for example, we might look to the untrained eye, we'll say that both of these are, so start here and end here. We're saying both of these are cleans, right? Because she starts with the weight on the ground, and she lifts it up, and now she's holding it in a front squat position. It looks like she just did a clean. But what's important is what happens in between. It'll go to that. All right. So if we look here, we're not getting triple extension in the knees or the hips. Ankles really aren't even fully plantar flexed. And then as she goes to catch, we see that bar path is coming way out from her body, right? So pretty inefficient here. This isn't going to help improve power. We compare it here, and granted, you can probably argue a lot of things wrong with this, but for the sake of this argument, here we got good triple extension in the knees, hips, and ankles. She's keeping that bar close as she pulls herself under to catch, and then she ends up standing upright. So those are two very different techniques that we're using here, right? But this is going to be high reps almost inevitably. This is going to take a lot of coaching and a lot of patience to work to that point. So there's lots of other drills we can evaluate. One of the big keys is to make sure that you're seeing them be explosive, right? And that's something that I'm sure everyone in this room could look at and say, like, that's being explosive or that's not. And we want quality over quantity here. So we're not, again, trying to gas or run these athletes into the ground. We're trying to make them more powerful. There's a video next that's probably why it's slow. Okay, so if we look at this, the top video autoplay. These might not work. Well, before it moves on to the next slide, if we look at just where he's landing relative to that hurdle, we see we're not getting a very big horizontal displacement here. And on this one, and you just have to trust me on this, but he's jumping outside these lines here where he's being really explosive, okay? So he's having to really catch himself coming from a pretty big launch and then really impart a lot of force into the ground to get back over across that other line. Come on. There we go. All right, so we'll look at some appropriate progressions that we can utilize then. Maybe. All right, so let's see where we are. When we're training power, we use appropriate volume, appropriate rest periods, all those kinds of things to elicit the changes we're seeking. As it's saying in this slide, we want to start with closed drills so that the athlete knows what to expect. They get to ingrain those patterns as reflexes so that when we move them to open drills where they're having to react, now those reflexes are the appropriate patterns that we've created, right? So when they're playing sport, they don't get to choose, exactly how they set up to jump or whatever. They have to react to their opponent. Repeating faulty patterns, like I said before, is going to ingrain those as reflexes, and we don't want to teach them the wrong way to do that, to do any of these things that we've talked about. So in general, and these aren't hard, fast rules, but we're looking just kind of generally when we're working with athletes on these types of things, volume of power and plyometric movements. Typically we're keeping under 10 repetitions per set. So over the course of an entire workout, we're looking for 100 total ground contacts. Or if we're doing something that's highly CNS intensive, we want to keep it around 40. Rest and recovery needs to allow for complete regeneration. So that's one of those things you might say, okay, well, I want to program in 2 minutes of rest here. But if you see that your athlete's still sucking wind and he's not ready to go again, then don't have him go again, right? Thought we had this covered this quick thing. All right. So some of the same information there. We'll move on. So we'll look at this in phases, and we'll look at each of these individually as we move forward. But we can break down like a plyometric training progression into a few phases. So phase one, we would be talking about a single response. So that's the response, the force that we impart into the ground, and then we want to like utilize a box so that we can catch that athlete in midair. So there's no impact from them landing, really. So here we're having them practice that counter movement takeoff. We're having them practice their landing position, so we don't want to see knees caving in. We don't want them leaning over too far, whatever. But that's kind of phase one. So that's one way that the box really is a useful tool, right? That's a phase one tool. Phase two, we're going to bring in multiple responses here, where we're going to have the force from takeoff on the ground and then the force from landing back on the ground, okay? So that's a little higher impact when we're having the athlete land back on the ground. So this is introducing some new impacts. It's going to be a little harder on CNS because of that. And then we want to, so we can practice them sticking that landing or then even moving into a second jump with a little recovery bounce, which we would have a sample video. It probably won't work though. And then as we move to phase three, we're going to introduce elasticity. So this is where we're going to move from, it'll come up here in a second. We're going to move from one jump directly into the other. So we're turning into like a human pogo stick, right? We hit the ground and immediately bounce back up for a max effort jump. So that's really kind of how the depth jumps work, or true plyometrics in this phase, is that we're moving through space, we hit the ground, we decelerate, and then immediately accelerate in the opposite direction. And again, this will produce the greatest vertical displacement as we're training, but then also it's going to elicit the greatest effects on vertical displacement from a counter movement jump or a dead stop. Sorry, I know this has got to be painful for y'all waiting for these. And this one's not going to work, but just got to wait for it to go. But so basically what he's doing here is he's going to jump between these hurdles. Whoop. Broke it. So he's going to jump between those hurdles. Just imagine that he's still there. For the first part of this progression, he's going to jump as high as he can, land softly, and then completely reset. Then he's going to jump again, right? Second part of that, he's going to jump, hit the ground, have a little recovery bounce like somebody that doesn't know how to jump rope yet. You do that little hop in the middle, and then he's going to go into his next jump. I have no idea. Fell asleep. I know. Cool, thank you. Yeah. All right, good. So then that last phase of that jump, like I said, that's where he's just reacting. He's hitting the ground and moving it immediately. So that's something that a client might not be able to do in their first couple of weeks, even if you're doing this. So that's a progression you're going to have to be patient with. But then as you have an athlete that you know is ready for that, that's something you might take them through that whole progression within a day. So looking at the Olympic lifts, we talked about clean and jerk and snatch, and then also their variations, which variations is probably what we're going to be more focused on for a greater number of athletes. We don't all need to be Olympic lifters. I think we've mentioned that before, but unless your program's specifically calling for that, like you're competing CrossFit or doing Olympic lifting, weightlifting competitions, you probably don't need to do a snatch, from the ground, anything like that. So we're keeping these 6 reps or fewer per set, depending on the program, but we don't really want to go over that. And when we're doing really explosive reps, we want to keep it to about 20 or so total. Again, rest can be pretty long on this, just making sure your athlete's ready to move on. So like I said, not every athlete needs to become an Olympic lifter. Olympic lifts are not an end in themselves. They're a means to an end, right? We're using them to create more power. It's one of those places on the force velocity curve that we want to work using this tool. But they don't have to become proficient weightlifters. And like I said before, again, not all athletes need to pull from the ground. So our weightlifting progression, we'll have 3 steps here. Number 1, we want to master the positions. So we want to achieve enough mobility for an athlete to get in an overhead squat or a front squat. They need to have elbows up, flat back, all those types of things. This cat right here is probably not ready to move on to cleans, right? He looks a little tight. Number 2, we want to gain the strength. So now that we're able to get in those positions, we want to make that athlete strong. You can't out clean your front squat. You can't. You're not going to out snatch your overhead squat, right? And then number 3, we want to groove those patterns. So we want to, be very patient. This is going to be the part that's going to take the longest because moving through this stuff is definitely not easy. But again, we want to put a lot of focus into doing this as perfect as possible because that's what is going to elicit, changes in power. So before we go overloading a client and seeing, hey, can they hang clean 315, we want to make sure that everything's good. Their takeoff and landing position are all going to look good. Sprint training. Again, we want to look at the 10 to 60 yard area there. 10 or fewer max effort sprints. Even if you've ever read any Charlie Francis stuff, he'll say if he has an athlete that goes in and sets a PR for a sprint that day, then he's going to send them home, right? Because they've met what they were trying to achieve that day. There's no reason to keep beating them down after that point. Most sports are rarely going to require an athlete to sprint any further than 30 or 40 yards, and we were looking at football and a lot of those things. I think that's typically happening under 10 yards, and depending on the position of the player, but it's pretty short sprints. They don't need to be running miles around the track or anything like that. This focuses on applicable distances, and it keeps the athlete alactic because here we're not again trying to do any metabolic conditioning. Injury's not so much of a concern here, but we do want to focus on form. So their first step, speed, their body position as they're sprinting, those types of things are going to be important here. And fatigue is going to send those in the wrong direction. So bringing this all together, I think a lot of those things, like we talked about with the box jumps for height, we're missing parts of the equation here when we make the assumption that, or our patrons, athletes, clients make these assumptions saying that, well, I've seen coaches use whatever, fill in the blank to develop power, so if I go do something that looks like that, then now I'm developing power, right? So that's not taken into account a lot of the things we talked about here, which is, the quality of work, the technique, the rest periods, set and rep schemes, all those types of things, right? So the conclusions here, wrapping everything back up, we can treat everybody like an athlete. They don't all have to ever make it to this point, but improved power is going to help people. I mean, even if it's elderly clients that need to be able to stop and change directions, catch themselves from a fall, they're benefiting from these things. Effective techniques in terms of power are going to focus on the nervous system. Technique should not be abused by working to fatigue, so we need to understand what it is we're going for and focus on that one thing. We don't have to have pictures of everybody laying on the ground afterwards. And then proper rest and recovery are crucial for eliciting power adaptations. We hit on that several times, but yeah, we don't have to gas and sweat is not the thing we use to judge the quality of the workout, right? Guys, thank you. I apologize for the little technical things. Thank you all for still being here. I know it's been a long day. But if y'all have any questions, you're not ready to run right out, then let me know. So, yeah.